Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this web meeting organized in the context of the public consultation on the draft scientific opinions on dietary reference values for sodium and chloride. I have here with me in the virtual meeting room Professor Androniki Naska, Chair of the Working Group on DRVs for Minerals and Vice Chair of the NDA panel, and Professor Peter Aget, member of the Working Group on DRVs for Minerals. And in the physical room here in EFSA, with me are some colleagues from the nutrition unit and also from the unit on assessment and methodology support, namely Agnès de Cesmaison-Le Carré, Silvia Baltenia Martinez, and Laura Cicolalo. And I'm Valerio Courtui, the head of the nutrition unit, and I welcome you again, all of you, to this meeting. I would like to remind you that EFSA has launched a public consultation on the draft scientific opinions on dietary reference values for sodium and chloride on the 3rd of April. And through that call, we invited all interested parties to submit written comments by 22nd of May through the electronic template provided on the EFSA website. In completion to that public consultation, we organized this meeting with the scope to provide clarifications on the conclusions reached by the NDA panel. And we will also collect all your comments as part of the public consultation, and they will be considered by the panel in finalizing the two scientific opinions. Now to the agenda, I would like to highlight that we split the presentation in 3 parts. And after each part, we will have a session of questions and answer. Please note that in order to avoid background noise, your microphones will be muted. And those connected by phone, please take care to ensure that there is no background noise from your side as well. However, you can ask questions in writing during the whole meeting through the chat box, and our panelists will address them during the Q&A sessions. Then, if you have oral questions, please just send us a brief message through the chat box informing us about your intention to ask a question, and then we will give you the floor during the Q&A session. Please also be reminded that the meeting is recorded, and we have the intention to publish the recording on the EFSA website. And with that, I give the floor to Professor Androniki Naska to introduce you to the first part, scope and methodological framework, and identification of the criteria on which to base dietary reference values. Professor Naska, please.
Thank you, Valerio, and good morning to all, and thank you very much for your participation and your contribution. I assume you can all hear me well. I do not hear any comments about the sound. So we are ready to begin this presentation of the 2 opinions on dietary reference values for sodium and chloride, starting with part 1, where I will try to give you a summary of the scope and the methodological framework in which, in the NDA panel, we develop this type of opinions, and how we worked in the particular case of sodium and chloride. And the second part of this presentation will focus on the criteria which were identified as potential to be used for setting the DRVs. Agnès, I will be able to change the slides?
Yes, you should be able now.
I should be able. Well, yes, now it works. So our starting point, where did we start? EFSA received a request from the European Commission to advise on population reference intakes of micronutrients in the diet. And actually, the previous recommendation, the previous values, came from a 1993 publication of the Scientific Committee for Food on nutrient and energy intakes for the European Community. So the mandate that EFSA received was to review and complete these recommendations dating back to 1993 in the light of new evidence. This is how we started, and I must admit that the process was long and thorough. We initiated the task to review the literature around sodium and chloride in 2016. And very early in the process, we realized that we had to probe into the evidence relating sodium intake to health outcomes. And actually, what we decided at that point of time was to run our own systematic review. For this, we applied the EFSA Prometheus approach. Prometheus stands for Promoting Methods to Evidence Use in Scientific Assessments. And although it's a long title, actually the underlying principles, the core, the heart of the Prometheus approach is the principles of a thorough, standardized, and very well controlled review as we all know it. Prometheus has 4 pillars: to plan your review, and actually to publish your plan, your protocol for the review. Then, following the comments received, to apply your plan, to carry out the review, to verify that everything was done according to the initial planning, and then to report. Following the Prometheus process, in September 2017, we released for public consultation our protocol for the systematic review in relation to sodium intake and health outcomes. Next to the protocol, we published a technical report, which actually was a preliminary version of the opinion. And we thought it as necessary and useful for the readers, because actually that was the information we used when we developed the protocol for the systematic review. Comments were received, they were used, they were taken into consideration to amend the protocol, and in 2018 we carried out the review. We completed the opinion in the light of the evidence generated, and in the first months of 2019, the opinion was endorsed by the NDA panel. As Valerio mentioned, and as I'm sure you all know, it is now released for public consultation. Following everybody's comments, following your comments, it will be amended and finalized, and according to the plan, the final version will be adopted by the NDA panel in the July plenary meeting, and the opinion will be published together with a technical report on how the comments were addressed. Before moving into the details, of course, it is more common to acknowledge the contributors at the end, but I'm sure you will agree with me that the work is so huge that they would have to keep repeating the contributors in almost every step as we speak. So let me acknowledge the contributors quite early in the process. And in this slide, you see the 7 members of the EFSA working group on DRVs for minerals. Some of the EFSA staff, Laura, Agnes, and Sylvia, who were very actively involved in this work. Of course, there were other staff, EFSA staff, who participated or who contributed in specific parts, but Laura, Agnes, and Sylvia were there during the whole process, and the members of the NDA panel, which endorse and adopts the opinion. Now, coming to the methodological framework. A DRV opinion has 3 pivotal steps. First, to collect the relevant background information. Based on this background information, to identify the criteria on which to base DRVs. And you understand, of course, that for setting DRVs, any evidence on a dose-response relationship is of utmost importance. To say it as simply as possible, this is actually what we are looking for. And finally, to integrate all the available evidence and derive the values. In relation to the background information, here is a list of this information collated, collected, and interpreted. Actually, what you see in this slide are the subheadings of sections 2 and 3 in the opinion, where we describe, in summary, of course, what we know, what is the current knowledge in relation to sodium functions, physiology, and metabolism, interaction with other nutrients, such as interactions with potassium, for instance, biomarkers, effects of genotypes, and information on sources of sodium in the European diets, as well as data on current intakes. If you have any questions in relation to these sections, we will be able to address them during the Q&A section, but for the moment being, please allow me to focus only on biomarkers. I will use only one slide for that, simply because this background information is very important to understand the framework in which we developed our protocol, and we also appraised the accumulated evidence. Biomarkers of intake, sodium biomarkers of intake, and taking into account sodium physiology, in healthy individuals, urine is the major route of sodium excretion. Based on the available literature and the meta-analysis which has very recently been published, the panel concluded that on average, 93% of daily sodium intake is recovered in 24-hour urine. And this is the reason why, traditionally, urine collections have been considered as the most reliable measures to assess, to reflect, to estimate sodium intake in the diet. However, one should keep in mind that the estimates are affected by variations over days, variations over weeks, simply because there is a random variation in the amount of sodium we consume daily. But there are also other sources of variations which are independent of the daily intake. The panel reviewed a large body of evidence on the different methods based on urine collections, methods used to estimate sodium intake, and we also reviewed studies assessing the relative validity of the different methods. And we concluded that the 24-hour urine collection is the best available biomarker. However, we should keep in mind that complete collections is an important characteristic of this measure, because incomplete collections can introduce errors in the estimates, and this is why we paid particular attention for studies making use of 24-hour urine collections to have measures to ensure the completeness of the collections in the protocol, and of course that the levels in the collections are variable, as I described before. In conclusion, we consider that a single 24-hour urine collection is a reliable estimate of the average of the mean intake of a group of individuals. It is not, however, a reliable measure of the usual intake of a particular individual. Because of the random variation, there is a risk of random misclassification of the study participants. And for this reason, multiple collections per individual are preferred. We also reviewed other methods, other types of urine collections, such as casual or timed spot urine collections, urines collected overnight or during specific periods of time, and these methods are usually accompanied by predictive equations which allow to estimate from the spot urine from this specific sample to estimate the usual daily intake. We concluded that the reliability of this measure is largely affected by circadian variations, and after reviewing studies on the relative validity of these equations, we observed that the estimates of these equations can be biased and are usually biased towards the lower and the higher ends of the distribution. Having presented to you a very brief summary of the sections of the background knowledge and the information on biomarkers of intake, which I'm going to readdress in the slides to follow, I will now move to the pivotal steps in identifying the criteria on which to base DRVs. Our first step is to try to identify a biomarker which could be used as an indicator of sodium requirement. Having that addressed, the next step would be to review balance studies, and then finally to take into account the evidence relating sodium intake to chronic conditions and health consequences in general. Starting with the biomarkers of status as indicators of sodium requirement, we know that sodium balance is maintained over a wide range of intakes. Having in mind the background knowledge on sodium metabolism, on sodium physiology, we know that sodium balance is maintained through the activations of mechanisms triggered by neural and hormonal signals, such as the sympathetic nervous system and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. These homeostatic mechanisms maintain the systemic distribution, the acquisition, the excretion of sodium. They maintain the levels of plasma sodium over a very narrow range, with the absolute scope, the absolute target, to maintain water homeostasis. We also observed that hypo and hypernatremia are related to disorders affecting water and electrolyte balance and are seldom due to inappropriate intake, which means that these disorders will not be useful to set DRVs for sodium. Lastly, evaluating the possibility of plasma sodium concentration to serve as a biomarker of status, we conclude that it does not accurately reflect sodium body content. Actually, plasma sodium concentration can reflect overall sodium balance, but it is also well affected by the water balance or the potassium balance. It is also affected by the general osmolarity of the diet, of the body fluids such as blood or GI, sweat, urine, and only a small part of it can be affected by intake. Having all this in mind, and again I repeat the background knowledge on sodium homeostasis, we concluded that there are no appropriate biomarkers of sodium status that can be used for deriving the values for sodium. We reviewed then balance studies. And of course, when we talk about balance studies in this field, in this area, we are really talking about observations of sodium metabolism, studies which compare sodium excretion, sodium intake to sodium excretion, providing that the study allows for an adaptation period. And this is the result of the fact that sodium balance can be maintained over a wide range of intakes, as I mentioned before. Several of these studies bear important methodological limitations and were not considered of adequate quality to be included in this review. We identified, however, these metabolic studies among adults and one study among adolescents, which were thoroughly reviewed. And what we observed? We confirmed that sodium balance is maintained over a wide range of sodium intake, and please let me clarify that the range of intake which was used in the eligible balance studies ranged between 1.5 gram and 4.9 grams in adult and between 1.3 and about 4 grams per day in adolescents. We also reviewed several publications from a long-term and well-controlled metabolic study on sodium intake and excretion, which provides some evidence of rhythmical variations in the sodium body pool, which is independent of sodium intake. And lastly, we also observed that the response of the sympathetic nervous system and the RAS system, the neural and the hormonal signals I mentioned before, they became evident at excretions below 100 millimole per day. Overall, we concluded that because of sodium homeostasis, because of the specific findings I just mentioned in relation to variations independent of sodium intake, we concluded that balance studies or these metabolic studies cannot be used to determine sodium requirements, but they can be used to inform about the levels of sodium intake which are adequate to maintain balance. And of course, these metabolic studies provided us with information about the systemic mechanisms which are initiated to maintain this balance. Coming to the last part of the criteria used to set DRVs, what is the relation between sodium intake and health consequences? And in the protocol we released in 2017, we explained that we have selected we explained the reasons and we provided the information that we are going to focus on two categories of outcomes: blood pressure and cardiovascular disease and bone health. Those outcomes were selected on the basis of biological relevance for the general healthy population, their biological plausibility of the relation with sodium, that is, that there is a plausible mechanism behind that could support and explain any association observed, and of course the type of the evidence, the type of the studies. As I mentioned, the protocol was published and was released also in Prospero and Zenodo. Some details about the protocol. Which were the criteria used to select the studies to be reviewed? First of all, the design of the studies. We would like to focus on randomized controlled trials, RCTs, of either parallel or crossover design, as well as prospective observational studies of any type, including prospective cohort, case cohort, or nested case control studies. Regarding duration, in relation to blood pressure, the trials had to have at least a 4-week duration. In relation to heart CVD outcomes, at least 6 months duration, and in relation to bone health, at least duration of 1 year in order to measure indices related to BMD, bone mineral density, or the risk of osteoporotic fractures in adults. The population were children above 6 months of age and, of course, the adult, including the elderly population, the general population. Regarding methods to measure sodium, for reasons I explained before, we resumed to urinary sodium excretion calculated from single or multiple 24-hour urine collections. Allow me to spend 2 minutes more to give you some additional information on criteria we used for not selecting studies. So we were very careful not to include studies among diseased individuals, not to include studies in which concomitant interventions were applied when these interventions could have an impact on the outcome of our interest, and finally, in relation to the observational studies, we decided not to include studies in which prevalent CVD cases, that is, participants with a cardiovascular disease at the beginning of the study, were already in the study sample. We did not consider these studies, and we only considered studies where individuals did not report CVD disease. Regarding the appraisal of the risk of bias, we used an amended version of the tool developed by the Office of Health and Health Assessment of the National Toxicology Program, and we classified the studies as of low, moderate, or high risk of bias. In relation to blood pressure and CVD, we came with more than 7,000 records, and after excluding the majority of them, about 400 were selected to retrieve full-text articles. And after screening these articles according to the protocol and the eligibility criteria, we ended up with 45 studies. 36 were trials, were experiments, 9 were observational studies, and from these 36 trials, 32 were included in the meta-analysis which I'm about to present now. The evidence in relation to sodium levels, sodium intake, and blood pressure in adults. As I mentioned, 32 trials were selected according to our eligibility criteria. The vast majority were crossover trials, and also most of them were feeding trials, meaning that a change in sodium intake was introduced, and only some of them were counseling trials, education trials, where participants were advised to reduce or to change their sodium intake. To begin with, we performed a traditional random effect meta-analysis to identify the effect of sodium reduction in the pool of studies we have selected according to our criteria. And we further ran subgroup analysis to explore sources of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity, which could be due to methodological differences among the studies or differences in the context of the study. Primarily, I'm referring to the characteristics of the participants. Later on, to address the big question of the dose-response relationship, because as I said, this is very important in setting DRVs, we applied meta-regression models using mixed effects approaches, and in these models, we also evaluated the moderating effects of age and blood pressure status of participants through stratified analysis. The results. The results of the traditional meta-analysis, and let me pause for a moment to explain that all the methodology and the results are available in an appendix of the opinion. So again, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A session. I'm not going to go into very much detail. I'm just going to present the results which will be related or are quite important in understanding the second part of the presentation in setting DRVs. So coming back to the slide, the most important findings. From the traditional meta-analysis, we observed a significant reduction effect on both systolic and diastolic blood pressure associated with sodium reduction. In particular, sodium reduction was associated with a significant reduction of 3.9 millimeters of mercury in systolic and 2 millimeters of mercury in diastolic blood pressure. In relation to the dose-response analysis, we used several statistical tests to identify the shape, the nature of the slope, and the test clearly pointed towards a linear dose response over the range of the urinary sodium excretion observed in the various studies, that is, from 1.3 to 4.8 grams per day. Based on these meta-regression models, we also observed that for every 100 millimole increase in urinary sodium excretion, which could be translated to an increase of about 2.3 grams of sodium intake, systolic blood pressure increases by 5.3 millimeters of mercury, and diastolic blood pressure increases by 2.6 millimeters of mercury. Finally, the associations were stronger when hypertensives were compared to normotensives and among subjects aged 50 years and over. Next to the analysis of the trials, we identified one prospective cohort study which met our eligibility criteria and provided information on the long-term relationship between urinary sodium excretion and blood pressure levels. The study's acronym is EPOG-Flamengo, and you are going to see the acronym later on in the slides I'm going to present. Very briefly, to give you an idea, it's a cohort of about 1,500 individuals pulled together from different cohorts in Europe. And during the phase of appraising the study for the risk of bias, we concluded that this study was of moderate risk of bias. And we also have some information in relation to the risk of hypertension. Two RCTs actually is phase 1 and phase 2 of the US TOP trial, a low risk of bias trial, and two prospective cohort studies. One is again the EPOG-Flamengo study I just mentioned, and the second one is a study among Dutch individuals, which was judged to be of low risk of bias, and they both provided information on the relation between urinary sodium excretion and risk of hypertension. Overall, this evidence supports the positive relation between urinary sodium excretion and blood pressure, which we observed through the analysis of data retrieved from the RCTs. Therefore, the panel concluded that overall, this evidence provides a strong indication of a positive relation between sodium excretion and therefore sodium intake and blood pressure. In children, we identified 2 RCTs eligible for inclusion in our review, one of low and one of moderate risk of bias, and 2 publications from the German Donald study, a prospective cohort study among children. Overall, the 2 RCTs did not provide evidence for an effect of sodium reduction on blood pressure in school-age children, and the publications from the Donald study did not point to a significant association between urinary sodium and blood pressure in prepubertal and pubertal children. However, a weak evidence was obvious from the prospective study, from the Donald study, for a positive association between sodium levels during adolescence and systolic blood pressure later on in adulthood. Overall, of course, that was findings important to be considered for the children, but of course, because of the limited number of studies, no more quantitative analysis was performed. And I'm now moving to the cardiovascular diseases, the hard endpoints. No RCT was eligible for inclusion according to our criteria, and we identified some prospective cohort studies. 3 cohorts provided evidence on sodium and risk of stroke and risk of coronary heart disease, and 3 cohorts also provided evidence on sodium and risk of cardiovascular disease overall. The 3 cohorts which provided evidence on either stroke or CHD was the PREVENT cohort. This is the cohort among Dutch individuals I mentioned before. Please keep in mind that in this cohort there was an oversampling of individuals with mild albuminuria. The EPOG Flamengo cohort, the pool of different European cohorts we mentioned before in relation to blood pressure, and a cohort of Finnish individuals, general population above 25 years of age. And you see also the appraisal, the working group's appraisal on the risk of bias for each study. In relation to the risk of cardiovascular disease overall, we had available publications from the control groups of the top 1 and 2 trials, prospective observations of the controls of the trials. Again, information was provided in the EPOG Flamengo cohort and an Italian study, the INCIANTI study, including individuals above 65 years of age. Of course, again, because of the small number of studies, no quantitative analysis was possible. And I will give you a brief summary of the findings in relation to CVD. I dare to say that the most important conclusion is that we are quite limited having in mind the evidence with the quality in the evidence we would like to have in our review. The evidence is very limited to draw any firm conclusion. And although, through our eligibility criteria, we tried hard to reduce possible sources of uncertainty, possible sources of bias, still some uncertainty remains, and we had to keep that in mind in setting our DRVs. In relation to CHD, there is some evidence for a positive association. However, in relation to the risk of stroke, there was some evidence for a negative association. We should keep in mind, though, that the number of studies providing indication of this inverse association is small, and the fact that a mechanism that could explain this inverse association is unclear particularly keeping in mind the strong evidence about the linear relationship between sodium intake, linear positive relationship between sodium intake and blood pressure. And finally, in relation to CVD, there was some evidence for a positive association. Coming to bone health, very quickly, we identified more than 1,700 records providing information. Most of them were excluded for many different reasons, and 40 were identified as potential to be used for full text retrieval. And among those 40 publications, 2 studies met our eligibility criteria. These 2 were primarily designed as RCTs, as trials, but because of changes in the study methodology in the process and the way the data were analyzed and reported in the publications, they were considered as prospective observational studies. In conclusion, the findings from these studies is that the evidence is limited and it is inconsistent, and therefore it cannot be used to set DRVs for sodium. I think that will bring me to the end of the presentation of part 1 on the background knowledge and the criteria we identified as important to set DRVs.
Okay, thank you very much, Ada, for this wonderful introduction. Now we have some time for questions and answers. We did not receive anything through the chat by now. I would like to remind you that if you want to address, if you have some questions to given orally, just give us a sign through the chat so we can unmute your micro and give you the floor. Yeah, then if there is nothing for the time being, then probably it's better to move on to the second part. And for that, I will give the floor to my colleague Agnès Desesmes-Maison-Le-Carré, and she will talk about the data on which to base DRVs and the conclusions for each population group. Agnès, please.
Thank you, Valerio. In this second part of the presentation, I'm going to summarize the data on which dietary reference values were based, with some emphasis on the method which was used to integrate the evidence and to account for the uncertainties associated to the evidence. I will then present the conclusions reached by the panel for each population group. First of all, based on the review of the available evidence and the findings which have just been presented by Ada, the panel concluded that the sodium requirement or its distribution in the population could not be determined, and therefore an absolute requirement and a population reference intake for sodium could not be established. Still, studies informing the relationship between sodium intake and blood pressure levels or cardiovascular disease risks and balanced studies on sodium were considered to provide relevant data to inform the setting of dietary reference values for sodium. In effect, data on the relationship between sodium intake and levels of blood pressure or cardiovascular disease risk could inform about the levels of sodium intake associated to a reduced risk of chronic diseases, and balanced studies could inform about the levels of sodium intake that are adequate to maintain a null sodium balance. Because of the limited evidence that Ada just mentioned and the associated uncertainties, it was not possible to identify such levels of sodium intake with certainty. It was apparent that expert judgment was required to weigh the evidence available and to take account of the associated uncertainties. Therefore, the experts decided to use a formal expert knowledge elicitation process to weigh and integrate the evidence. And I'm going to illustrate the method in the following slides. EFSA published a guidance on expert knowledge elicitation in 2014, and I invite you to download it from the EFSA's website in case you would like to know more about the approach. At the moment, let me summarize here the main elements. The expert knowledge elicitation is a formal method which is used to support experts in making evidence-based judgments about a quantity of interest, typically a parameter, in a structured manner. What is elicited is a distribution which express the judgment from the expert about the range of possible values of the parameter of interest and their relative likelihood. This method has several advantages. First of all, it is designed to mitigate psychological bias, which are well known to affect expert judgment. It is also a structured process which improves the rigor of reasoning. It allows a clear and unambiguous expression of uncertainty about the true value of the parameter of interest. And last but not least, it makes the rationale for the judgment transparent and documented. For sodium, the expert knowledge elicitation was conducted with the expert of the EFSA working group on dietary reference for minerals, who had been in charge of reviewing the available evidence and were well aware of the body of evidence. Judgments were elicited following the Sheffield protocol, which is designed to elicit the knowledge of a group of experts in a face-to-face elicitation meeting. It results in an uncertainty probability distribution that represents the expert's aggregated judgments achieved via discussion. It is to be noted that in this process, the presence of an elicitor is essential. The elicitor is a professional who is typically not in the field of interest and acts as an objective facilitator of the discussion. In practice, the process followed 4 steps, which are illustrated on this slide. First, the experts collectively reviewed the evidence dossier, which documented the key pieces of evidence relevant to the formulation of their judgment. Then, a separate distribution was elicited from each expert individually, as illustrated on the drawing on this slide. And then, individual judgments were shared by the experts within the group and discussed. Finally, a consensus distribution was elicited from the experts as a group. This is represented by the dashed curve in the graph. 2 separate elicitations were conducted in relation to the 2 sources of evidence available. In the first one, experts had to express their judgment about the levels of sodium intake associated to a reduced risk of cardiovascular diseases. The elicitation question used in the exercise is displayed on the screen, and this is question 1. In the second elicitation, experts had to express their judgment about the levels of sodium intake which are adequate to maintain a null sodium balance. Again, the elicitation question used in the exercise is displayed on the screen and is question 2. In the next 2 slides, I'm going to present the outcome of the 2 elicitations. My talk will focus on the principles of the exercise. I'm not going to enter into the details of the rationale for each judgment, which are described thoroughly in the opinions, but again, feel free to send specific questions through the chat. What you see now on the screen is the group consensus distribution, which was obtained in response to the first question. Thus, it expressed the expert judgment about the lowest level of sodium intake at which the risk of chronic disease, stroke and coronary heart disease in particular, is minimized in the general population of adults. As eligible studies in relation to this source of evidence use urine excretion as a marker of sodium intake, the scale used for the elicitation referred to urine excretion and was expressed in millimole per 24 hours, as you can see from the x-axis. In drawing this distribution, the experts integrated the evidence about the relationship between sodium and blood pressure and cardiovascular disease incidence. In particular, they took into consideration the strong evidence coming from experimental studies for a positive relationship between blood pressure and urinary sodium excretion in the range covered by the studies, that is 50 to 200 millimoles per day. And blood pressure is a well-established risk factor of cardiovascular diseases. Therefore, any increase in blood pressure level was considered adverse. Experts also considered the limited evidence from observational studies for a positive association between urinary sodium excretion and risk of hypertension, coronary heart disease, and total cardiovascular disease in the one hand, and the limited evidence from observational studies, again, for an inverse association between sodium urinary excretion and risk of stroke in the other hand. Again, it is important to stress that in drawing that distribution, the expert integrated the substantial uncertainty related to that relationship due to the low number of studies eligible and the unclear mechanism by which urinary sodium excretion could be inversely associated with the risk of stroke. Now coming to the figure, as you can see, looking at the evidence, the expert agreed that the level of interest was unlikely to be above 120 millimole per day and very unlikely to be below 40 millimole per day. Rather, they agreed that it was very likely to be between 40 and 120 millimole per day. The probability that this value is in the range 40 to 80 millimole per day and 80 and 120 millimole per day was actually judged to be almost equal and was centered around 80 millimole per 24 hour, which is equivalent to around 2 grams per day. It is to be noted that a slightly higher probability was given to the range 80 to 120 millimole per day in the light of the evidence on stroke. The fact that the difference in the probability assigned to the two ranges is small, only 5%, actually reflects the substantial uncertainty associated with the evidence on stroke. To sum up, and importantly, the distribution captures the uncertainty of the experts about the lowest level of sodium intake at which the risk of chronic disease is minimized in the general population. Now coming to the second elicitation exercise. What you can see on the screen again is the group consensus distribution obtained in response to this second question. This time, it expresses the expert judgments about the lowest level of sodium intake, which is adequate to maintain a null balance for the majority of the general population of adults. In relation to that question, the scale used for the elicitation was expressed in grams per day, as you can see from the x-axis, keeping the unit used in the balance studies. Again, the detailed rationale for the distribution is provided in the opinion, and I'm just going to outline the main elements. As can be seen from the figure, the experts considered that an adequate level of sodium intake was most likely in the range from 1 to 2.4 grams per day, and actually more likely to be between 1.5 and 2 grams. The distribution of the probability in the range 1 to 2.4 grams integrates several considerations. First, evidence from one well-designed balance study, which indicates that sodium balance could be maintained under heat stress with sodium intake as low as 1.5 grams per day. However, this study involved a small number of young men, thus there is uncertainty regarding the general population. Second, there is a lack of data on the health effects of a sustained activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the RAS system, which becomes apparent with sodium intake below 1 to 2 grams, as previously mentioned by Ada. Overall, the probability distribution was shifted towards the range 1.5 to 2.5 to cover most of the population and considering the lack of data from balance studies below 1.5 grams. Again, similar to the previous example, the distribution captures the uncertainty of the expert about the lowest level of sodium intake, which allows to maintain sodium balance for most of the general population. In the next step of the process, parametric distributions were fitted to these two group consensus distributions. And at this stage, urinary excretion values, which were expressed in millimole per 24 hours, were converted to grams per day in order to allow for the integration of the evidence. Based on the two fitted parametric distributions, cumulative uncertainty density functions were derived, and they are represented in the figure. Again, it is important to note that the curves reflect the uncertainty of the expert about the levels elicited. They do not represent the probability or risk of a given outcome, be it cardiovascular disease or sodium imbalance, associated with a given level of sodium intake. It's important to keep in mind to interpret the figure appropriately. These cumulative uncertainty density functions were helpful for the panel to integrate the two sources of evidence and derive reference values for sodium. And I'm going to illustrate how. In short, the red curve corresponds to the elicitation of the lowest level of sodium intake at which the risk of chronic disease, stroke and coronary heart disease in particular, is minimized. For the interpretation of the curve, it is important to bear in mind that it integrates evidence going into opposite directions. On the one hand, some evidence for a positive association between sodium and risk of coronary heart disease, and on the other hand, some evidence for an inverse association between sodium and risk of stroke. For this reason, going towards the right of the curve, the uncertainty that the risk of coronary heart disease is minimized increases. In contrast, as one moves towards the left of the curve, the uncertainty that the risk of stroke is minimized increases as well. Now, let's come to the blue curve. It is a cumulative density function corresponding to the elicitation of the lowest level of sodium intake that allows to maintain sodium balance. In this case, the interpretation of the curve is actually unidirectional. As one goes from zero towards the right, the confidence of including the level of sodium intake that is adequate to maintain balance increases. In identifying a reference value for sodium, the experts first aimed at identifying a level of sodium intake associated with a reduction of cardiovascular disease risk. The identification of such value was constrained by the bidirectional interpretation of the curve that I just explained, and therefore the median level of the distribution was chosen. Indeed, at the median, there is equal certainty that the level of sodium that is associated with a reduction of cardiovascular risk is neither overestimated nor underestimated. As can be seen here on the slide, from the curve, the median level corresponds to 2 grams sodium per day and is illustrated by the red dots. Now, moving to the blue curve, a level of sodium intake of 2 grams per day is likely to be adequate to maintain sodium balance for most of the general adult population. It is likely because, as you can see from the drawing, there is 75% probability that it covers the level associated with the maintenance of sodium balance, according to the expert judgment. And a probability of 75% was considered to be sufficiently conservative. Therefore, the panel concluded that 2 grams of sodium per day is a safe and adequate intake for the general population of adults. Now I'm going to spend a couple of words on the terminology that we use in relation to the values for sodium. As you may be aware, the type of dietary reference values were defined in 2010 by the EFSA NDA panel in an opinion on the principles on deriving and applying dietary reference value. This opinion includes a definition for each type of dietary reference values and provides guidance on how to use these values appropriately. It is to be noted that although the term safe intake was not defined in that opinion, the concept of a safe intake has been used in previous assessment from the panel when providing advice on a daily intake of a nutrient which does not rise to concerns about adverse health effects, in case a tolerable upper intake level could not be established. So it is not a new concept in relation to nutrient reference values. For the particular case of sodium, the reference value is called safe, as the value proposed takes account of an increased risk of cardiovascular disease at higher levels of sodium intake when exposure is prolonged. As defined in the principal's opinion, an adequate intake is a value estimated when a population reference intake cannot be established because an average requirement cannot be determined, and this is the situation we are in for sodium. The setting of an adequate intake involves more expert judgment that is used for determining average requirement and population reference intake. But the practical implication of an adequate intake is actually similar to that of population reference intake, in the sense that it describes the level of intake of a nutrient that is considered adequate for good health. Again, the distinctions of the terms relate to the different strains of the scientific basis on which they rest. The reference value for sodium is called adequate in line with this definition. Now I'm going to move to the other population groups that were considered in the evaluation, starting with pregnant and lactating women. While reviewing the evidence, the experts concluded that the requirement for the daily accretion rate of sodium in fetal and maternal tissues can actually be met by adaptive changes that maintain sodium homeostasis during pregnancy. Similarly, in lactation, no evidence was found that the sodium requirements differed from the requirement of non-lactating women. For this reason, the panel concluded that 2 grams of sodium per day was a safe and adequate intake for pregnant and lactating women as well. Now moving to infants. You may be aware that in the context of dietary reference value in Europe, we looked at the requirement of infants in the second half of their first year, and we do not establish any value for infants in the first half of their first year. For this group, there was a lack of data from which an average requirement could be derived, and therefore it was decided to set values by extrapolating estimated sodium intake of fully breastfed infants during the first 6 months of life, extrapolated upwards to the infants aged 6 months and above. Through this process, an adequate intake of 0.2 grams per day is proposed for infants in the second half of their first year. Moving to the children, there was also a lack of data from which an average requirement could be derived, and in that case, the panel decided to extrapolate the values for adults downwards to children based on the average requirement for energy and including a growth factor. The equation used for this extrapolation is displayed on the screen. I'm now going to summarize the different values which are proposed at this stage for sodium. So again, for the infants in the second half of their first year, an adequate intake is proposed of 0.2 grams per day. And for children between 1 and 3 years of age, a safe and adequate intake of 1.1 grams per day is proposed. For children aged between 4 and 6 years, a safe and adequate intake of 1.3 grams per day is proposed. For children aged from 7 to 10 years of age, safe and adequate intake of 1.7 grams is proposed. And for children starting as of 11 years of age until 17, the same value as for adults is proposed of 2 grams per day. Again, for adults, including pregnant and lactating women, a safe and adequate level of 2 grams per day is proposed by the panel. To finish this part of the presentation, I'm going to summarize some recommendations of research which have been formulated by the panel at the end of its assessment. It was found that there is a need for studies using robust assessment methods for sodium intake and the outcome of interest, which investigates the moderating effect of energy intake on the relationship between sodium intake and blood pressure. Studies are also needed about the health effects of sodium and in particular of the ratio between sodium and potassium intakes at intake levels approximating their respective dietary response values. It was also found that more research is needed about the life course effects of sodium intake on blood pressure, in particular the effect of sodium intake on neurohormonal control during childhood. More research is also needed, and it has been mentioned earlier in the presentation, about the effect of prolonged exposure to low sodium intake on the effective functioning of its homeostatic regulation. And in view of the paucity of data we found on bone health, we encourage more research about the effect of sodium intake on bone health, especially in growing and aging populations. And additional research on sodium intake, on the effect of sodium intake on renal function in the general population. Finally, we invite additional research on the characterization of genes involved in determining salt-sensitive phenotypes and of the moderating factors of salt sensitivity. With that, I'm closing my part of the presentation and inviting you to raise any question you might have.
Yes, thank you very much, Agnes. Now it's time for questions. You have the whole picture of the sodium DRV draft opinions. I remind you, you can submit the questions through the chat, the messaging box using the Skype. And also, if you have oral questions, just let us know briefly that you intend to have an oral question, and we will give you the floor by unmuting your microphone. Anyone to start? We see nothing coming through the chat box. No, seems to be everything so clear. Then I would say we move on with the third part. A few words about the DRV for chloride. And for that part, I give the floor to Professor Androniki Naska again. Ada?
Yes, thank you, Valerio. So, of course, sodium is the big star, but chloride has its own share of interest. And we worked in parallel and not together with sodium to review the evidence in relation to chloride, which is an important anion in intracellular and extracellular compartments. It contributes to many body functions, including the maintenance of osmotic and acid-base balance, muscular activity, nervous activity, and the movement of water and solutes. We worked in similar way to identify the background knowledge, to look for biomarkers of requirement, to look for balance studies, to look for criteria on which we could base the setting of DRVs. Overall, I'm waiting a little bit for the change of the slide to respond. Yeah, there it is. Observation number 1, actually a confirmation that kidney is the main route of excretion and that excretion of sodium and chloride in urine are closely related. In Western diets, sodium chloride is the major source of chloride intake, which is reflected in the similar levels of urinary excretion. Actually, this close interrelationship can be reflected in very high correlations between excretions of sodium and chloride. And on a molar basis, these electrolytes are excreted in similar amounts. There is also a close relationship between sodium and chloride balances in the body, again due to the hormonal control by the RAS system and cortisol. In addition, there is some evidence that chloride can contribute to the effect of sodium chloride on blood pressure, and there are studies suggesting that the full expression of sodium chloride-dependent elevation of blood pressure relies in the concomitant presence of both sodium and chloride. Lastly, an independent effect of chloride on cardiovascular risk has also been explored in observational studies using serum or plasma chloride concentrations. However, we concluded that serum and plasma chloride concentrations cannot be used as biomarker of status for reasons similar to that of sodium, and therefore no studies on the association between chloride intake or urinary excretion and cardiovascular disease could be used for the setting of DRVs. Having in mind these important points, we concluded that no data are available which can be used independently of sodium to determine an average requirement and population reference intakes for chloride. On the contrary, the reference values for chloride had to be set at values equimolar to the reference values for sodium for all life stage groups. And the values, again, consistent with the reference values for sodium, they are considered to be safe and adequate intakes for the general EU population, of course, and please keep that in mind, under the consideration that the main dietary source of chloride is sodium chloride. So having in mind the equimolar basis of the two elements, these are collectively the values for safe and adequate intake for adolescents and adults, about 3 grams per day, and for children, all extrapolated from the sodium values, and also for infants above 7 months, again extrapolated from the sodium values. Regarding recommendations from future research, given the fact that sodium chloride is gradually substituted by other chloride salts, and there may be increases of other sources of chloride intake in the diet, we deemed quite important to highlight the necessity to investigate the health effects of chloride independently to that of sodium. That was, for us, the most important recommendation for future research. I think that's all. Now everything is presented, and I hope that questions will arise.
Yes, thank you, Ada, very much. Indeed, if there are any questions to the part on the sodium or chloride, we are happy to respond to you. Either, as we said, in having your questions submitted in writing to the chat of the tool, or orally, if you give us a brief sign that you want to ask something, and we can open your microphones. No one wants to start? Probably you need some more time to think about, and you will submit your questions to the tool. Yeah. So if that's the case, I think we will try to resume. I would like to remind you all that you are very welcome to submit your comments to the public consultation through the tool and through the procedure that is announced in the public consultation announcement on EFSA website. And the deadline is the 22nd of May. Please bear in mind that comments submitted after the deadline cannot be taken into consideration. And all your comments that you have will be considered by the panel in finalizing the two opinions, and they will be addressed also in a technical report that we will publish together with the scientific opinion. Having said that, it remains me only to thank very warmly to the speakers for their effort, to my colleagues here in the room, as well to thank to you all for participating to this web meeting, for your interest. And again, we are awaiting your comments submitted by the 22nd of May. Thank you very much, and goodbye.